All righty. Um, let's get started. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to the Pennsylvania Hallowed Grounds Roundtable session. My name is Barbara Barksdale, and I am the chair of the Pennsylvania Hallowed Grounds. I'm not going to take much of your time. I just wanted to say welcome, and we hope that you will be enjoying, I know you will be enjoying this session, and I know that you're going to learn an awful lot about what Elizabeth is going to share with you as far as the burial practices and cemetery laws in Pennsylvania. All I can say is I want you to learn from it, share it, re-listen to it at a later date also, and hopefully get all of your questions answered. I know we had a nice amount of questions that came in early on, which is great, and I'm sure that she has also taken a look at most of them. So hopefully you'll be able to get your questions answered, but if not, there's going to be other ways that Crystal's going to let you tell you about. So anyway, what I'm going to do, I'm going to turn this right on over to our vice president, or I'm going to say vice president, our vice chair, Crystal Crampton. And Crystal's not only the vice chair, but she is also one of the coordinators of the roundtable. So, Crystal, I want you to take it away.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking the time today to come visit our roundtable and for actually putting your questions into the chat early. That would give our speaker enough time to answer some harder questions. We have a couple of housekeeping rules. One being your mics are going to be turned off, also your video. So the focus will be on our speaker. You can put your questions in the chat. Also, you can raise your hand after our speaker speaks, and if you didn't have your question in the chat. Also, just remember our roundtable will be recorded as you hear, and it'll be on YouTube and our website after. Give us about a day, and then it'll be on there. Also, we will have a link placed in our newsletter, and a link will be at the when you're registered. When you registered to be on this, the link will follow to that. Um, I'm going to introduce Bertha now, and she will talk about our speaker. Bertha?
Yes, good evening. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us. And tonight, the title of our program is Burial Practices and Cemetery Laws in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. I'm just going to introduce Elizabeth Rairigh. Our speaker. Elizabeth Rairigh is the Preservation Services Division Manager at the Pennsylvania State Historic Preservation Office, also known as SHPO. In her role at the SHPO, she manages the National Register Program and serves as the Certified Local Government Coordinator. Ms. Rairigh has an undergraduate degree in anthropology from the College of William and Mary in Virginia, and a Master's of City Planning and a Master's in Historic Preservation from the University of Pennsylvania. Elizabeth?
Yes, hi.
Hi. Okay, you're on.
Okay, here we go. First, I wanted to say thank you for the invitation to speak tonight. We at the SHPO are always happy to share information that we know about preservation practices and preservation best practices across the Commonwealth. So I'm very happy to be able to share the information that I know with all of you. The questions that I got were really interesting and had me diving a little bit deeper into some of our cemetery law. But that said, I will preface this whole thing by saying that I am not a lawyer. So this is my interpretation, in some cases, of the reading of the law, and consult with your legal counsel for more specific answers to some of these questions. So thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you today. As was mentioned, I am with the State Historic Preservation Office, which is one bureau within the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission. We are under the umbrella of PHMC with our sister and brother and sibling agencies, the State Archives, the State Museum, and Historic Sites and Museums. The State Historic Preservation Office, you can find us in many different online venues. We are at PA Trails of History on Facebook and Instagram, and our YouTube channel So feel free to reach out to us any way that you can. The State Historic Preservation Office, just briefly, has about 27 staff members working across 4 divisions: preservation incentives, preservation services, environmental review, and preservation support. Our work is supported and guided by a governor-appointed 15-member board. The Pennsylvania Historic Preservation Board serves as an advisory body to the PHMC and to the SHPO. They review National Register nominations and provide advice on our statewide historic preservation plan, as well as sharing local knowledge and expertise on preservation matters. Some of these topics that we're going to talk about tonight have been things that the board and PHMC have been talking about for quite some time. PHMC and the SHPO has a long history of answering burial questions, providing guidance on cemetery preservation, and on the treatment of human remains. We are a go-to resource for a lot of people on issues related to cemetery preservation, including the documentation, conservation of monuments and gravestones, and legal matters related to ownership and access. We're also contacted for technical information and for access to funding. We advise state and federal agencies on appropriate care of human remains discovered on Commonwealth property and during the course of publicly assisted projects. The State Museum also works with Native communities on the appropriate stewardship and repatriation of Native American remains and artifacts that may be in the agency's collections. We do have a website dedicated to cemetery preservation and recordation, which you can see here. It is a static web page at this point, but it is on our list of things to be updated soon. So this presentation will be actually folded into an update of these pages. I'm going to take you through just a little bit of history on cemetery development in the Commonwealth over time. So we're starting here 1720 to 1820 with Potter's Fields. This is an image of Washington Square in Philadelphia. The northwest corner was a potter's field and later held Washington's fallen soldiers, individuals from the Walnut Street Jail, and those citizens from a yellow fever epidemic. For those who could not afford a vault or a grave, or those who were not associated with a congregation with its own burial site, Potter's Fields were a final resting place. Early Potter's Fields were not separate cemeteries, but initially were burial areas incorporated into vacant portions of existing church graveyards or a designated community burial ground. It's often difficult to trace Potter's Fields since they were usually unmarked and were used for just a short amount of time. And again, this is one of our most infamous Potter's Fields, Washington Square. Today it is a public park and has interpretive panels telling its history, as well as a tomb for unknown soldiers of the American Revolution. Beginning around 1810, 1820, urban communities began to re-examine the handling of burials, especially in association with epidemics. Concerns for overcrowding and health hazards led to a campaign for a new type of burial place. The answer became a mutual, non-sectarian cemetery or municipal cemetery located on the fringes of a town or urban area and separate from a religious setting. The change also represented a new attitude towards order and the beautification of burial grounds. They were often designed on a geometric grid pattern with wide pathways, suitable plantings, and enclosed by a stone wall or a fence. Lots could be sold to families at affordable prices to the lower and middle classes. These were independently owned and controlled by a company or municipally owned when they developed similar formal garden cemeteries on the edges of town, but those tended to be less successful than private ventures. Between 1826 and 1830, at least 4 such cemeteries were founded in Philadelphia on the southwest edges of the city. This is an image from Easton Cemetery, which was established just a little bit later in 1849 and is the earliest and best surviving example of a romantic park-like cemetery in the Lehigh Valley metro area. In the 1830s, major cities in the United States, Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, established large rural cemeteries on sites carefully chosen for accessibility and natural beauty. Laurel Hill in Philadelphia is a great example of this. It quickly influenced other American cities with Victorian concepts of how to approach death. These cemeteries were privately owned and operated and offered peaceful, romantic settings for both the wealthy and the average citizen. Plots were often defined by carved granite stonework, sculpted rails, and gates or iron fencing. This is an image of Allegheny Cemetery in Pittsburgh. The preservation of these types of rural cemeteries is a daunting task due to the lack of endowed plots, the variety of materials included in their monuments, and the overall landscaping responsibilities. More recently, lawn park and memorial park cemeteries began to flourish and continued through the 1920s and into today. Cemeteries are characterized by pastoral, park-like, or lawn settings, and are slightly smaller in scale and less picturesque than the larger rural cemeteries that often served as parks. This is an example of a lawn park cemetery in which the stones are above ground, whereas a memorial cemetery would largely have flat stones that could be mowed over. This is an example from Ballackinwood. This is the Marion Memorial Park. We can really put the issues that we get asked about cemeteries into a couple of different ways to approach it. If you're going to group the cemeteries into the types of questions that come up, there are different questions for active and well-maintained cemeteries, those that are perhaps neglected and abandoned, and those that are forgotten and unknown. When I first started at the SHPO, this was one of the biggest topics of the day. This was the Arch Street Burial Ground in Philadelphia. This was 2016, 2017 time period. There was a big excavation related to a new construction project, and they ran into a lot of bones. And unfortunately, no one knew what to do with them. Everyone was pointing fingers at everyone else. It involved our office. It involved the city's Department of Licenses and Inspections and the city's Historical Commission. And no one really had any jurisdiction over the remains. There were different rules coming from different people. Licenses and inspections got involved. It ended up with the Orphans Court in Philadelphia in order to determine what to do with the burials. They were eventually all moved to a new cemetery, which interestingly is where they were supposed to have been in the first place. Everyone believed that the cemetery that was originally on this site had been moved in the 1800s, and in fact, most of it had not been moved. This is not isolated to that time period, however. We've had instances, this is from 2019, when additional graves were discovered in another development. And about 3 days ago, they found additional human remains on Temple University's campus on a construction site. The folks at Temple said this was not unexpected because the construction site occupies a portion of a former monument cemetery that was acquired by the university and the Board of Education in the 1950s. And the remains at that time were moved to the Longview Memorial Park. So there are clearly some that they missed and are still there. So these are Temple is following a protocol which involves the coroner's office, medical examiner's office, archaeologists, and law enforcement. Not just centered around Philadelphia, there are lots of other issues in other places as well. We had outreach from a number of years ago from a small borough in Lehigh County when they were looking for historic graves in that area as well. The other types of questions and issues that surround historic cemeteries, touch a variety of different topics. There are people looking for donations to maintain cemeteries. There are folks looking to sell cemeteries and buy cemeteries. There are people trying to prevent other folks from visiting cemeteries. There are people trying to get access so that they too can be buried next to a loved one. And these cemetery issues are complicated. It is a very interwoven process between multiple agencies, and there is no real clear-cut path for any of these issues, unfortunately. Shortly after the Arch Street incident that I mentioned a few moments ago, our office convened a gathering of a variety of different statewide stakeholders across the Commonwealth. We had representatives from Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, Community and Economic Development, the courts, the police, Department of Health, Department of Real Estate, all the different agencies that we could find in legislation that were mentioned. And we started conversations around how to best approach unexpected fines, cemetery maintenance issues, and a whole variety of topics. At that same time, we were gathering information for our statewide historic preservation plan, which was called #PreservationHappensHere. At that time, we were accepting public comment and issues that people wanted us to address within the preservation plan. There were lots of mentions of cemeteries and burial places throughout that public comment period. These are just some of them. A lot of them evolved around state funding or local funding. There was lots of questions about access, lots of questions about headstones, and unexpected finds. We then took all that information and wove it into the causes and influences and our action plan items for the statewide historic preservation plan at that time, which was published in 2018. We have continued to address these issues in our new historic preservation plan, which we just launched this year, which will be a 10-year plan. And we have included cemetery issues as one of the guiding principles within this plan as a key issue that will need to be addressed in the future. So, like I mentioned, we had a convening of different agencies a number of years ago to start to address topics surrounding burials and unexpected finds in cemeteries. We also convened and requested that the Center for Rural Pennsylvania do a study on legislation as it applies to historic and archaeological human remains and burial sites in Pennsylvania. So they did a great look at the legislation in the Commonwealth, and what I'm going to present is a summary of some of their findings for this. One of the most important things, fortunately or unfortunately, about preservation regulations in the Commonwealth is that no specific legislation exists regarding historic and archaeological human remains and interments. Instead, it is a loosely associated collection of laws that are scattered across unconsolidated statutes, consolidated statutes, and the Pennsylvania Code. These laws were enacted for specific reasons and are under the purview of many various agencies. No documents until this report was done combined or summarized all of the relevant legislation to help facilitate the processing of these sites. And it is unlikely that most cases involving historic human remains have been handled according to the same protocol. It can be argued that existing legislation is not appropriate for dealing with archaeological and historic cases, and that there is a lot of work that still needs to be done. The majority of burial legislation is written for recent cases with consideration for above ground burial items such as grave markers, known or active burial grounds, and recently deceased bodies. So we're going to do an overview of some of the legislation that exists in Pennsylvania for burial places and burials. As I mentioned, they are administered by a variety of different state agencies, including the Real Estate Commission, Labor and Industry, the Attorney General, the Department of State, and the Court of Common Pleas. PHMC, the Commonwealth's official history agency, is only referenced in one law related to burial places. Pennsylvania's legal framework, as I mentioned, consists of laws enacted in the late 19th through mid-20th centuries through a series of unconsolidated statutes from as early as 1887. There are at least 10 state laws specifically related to this topic. They are focused almost exclusively on the management of burial places by churches, nonprofits, and municipalities. They tend to be focused on identifiable burial places, even if they are abandoned and neglected. And there is little legal guidance on what to do about forgotten or unanticipated burial places. Title IX seems to have the most information in one place related to human burials. Title IX defines the term burial ground, cemetery, and private cemetery, among other terms, and emphasizes regulations of cemetery companies and the transfer of ownership. It includes laws governing the buying or selling of cemeteries or plots and the permanent lot care of established cemeteries. There are then other remaining laws that address issues of ownership, acquisition, conveyance, and the relocation of human remains, markers, and cemetery objects. The laws around acquiring and selling cemeteries require approvals from the Court of Common Pleas. for public acquisition and the selling of burial places by religious organizations and cemetery associations. There are additional requirements to petition the Court of Common Pleas regarding the relocation of human remains. And other cemetery laws include the Cemeteries and Graveyard Protected Act, which prohibits constructing a road through cemeteries. It really makes you question why some of these rules had to be put in place. Like, where was the road that they were trying to put through a cemetery? And the Cemetery Companies Interment Rights Store and Maintain law, which relieves cemetery owners of a responsibility to maintain historic burial places and limits liability. In 1994, they established sort of an amendment to Title IX, which was the Historic Burial Places Preservation Act. This defined an historic burial place as one in existence as a burial place for more than 100 years. There were no burials there in the last 50 years. There are no anticipated future burials, and the burial place is listed in or eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. This is the act that includes references to the Historical Museum Commission. It places conditions on how and where municipalities can acquire and use historic burial places. It prohibits municipalities from condemning them through eminent domain and then using the place for other purposes. And it requires our approval, the PHMC, before they can take a cemetery for a public use. Additionally, we have to be notified, and the County Recorder of Deeds also must be notified if burials are removed. It defines destruction of tombs, monuments, and gravestones. It criminalizes the possession of funerary objects, but does not go as far as to mention specifically human remains. The report also had some recommendations for future efforts to update legislation, specifically to enact legislation for archaeological and historic human remains and burials that allows for the respectful treatment of remains and supervision of procedures by professional archaeologists. It was suggested that a new piece of legislation be created to supersede all the other legislation that has been created and applied to one law in one place. It recommends stop work orders when human remains are found. It suggests adequate funding for both the preservation and maintenance of cemeteries, as well as for PHMC to conduct the duties that would be required under a new act. And it would hopefully establish a clear chain of command for when human remains are found. There are some interesting recommendations that have come out of other states recently as well. I saw just the other day that Maryland passed a few new bills regarding cemeteries. One, to establish an abandoned and neglected cemeteries fund to provide for the care, preservation, maintenance, and restoration of abandoned and neglected cemeteries to the tune of $250,000. The funds have not been appropriated, but the legislation was created. And the other was to create a inventory to identify historic cemeteries and prioritize investment in preservation of those cemeteries. We are asked a lot about listing cemeteries in the National Register of Historic Places, and that is one of the programs that I administer here at the SHPO. Typically, under National Register criteria, cemeteries and graves are not among those properties that are ordinarily considered eligible for listing in the National Register. They have to meet additional special requirements in order to be eligible. Often that is associated with the layout, the architecture, the landscape architecture, and sort of the physical pieces of the cemetery, and less to do with who is buried there. The National Register of Historic Places is at its core an honorary program. It does not inherently protect or preserve sites, but can be an honorary way to recognize significance of historic places across the country. It is the nation's official list of those places worthy of preservation. So we are asked to review cemeteries often for their eligibility for listing in the National Register. There are specific additional guidelines that the National Park Service has established for evaluating and registering cemeteries and burial places. I did a quick search earlier today and found that the Commonwealth has, I was actually surprised at this, 41 listed cemeteries, individually listed cemeteries. There are 2 National Historic Landmark cemeteries in the Commonwealth, and there are 6 listed resources under the term burial ground. This doesn't include cemeteries that may be included within a larger historic district. These are just those that are individually listed. So it is more difficult to list an individual cemetery than your average other site. A couple of years ago, we tried to make it easier to list historic cemeteries in the National Register of Historic Places. This is the African American Churches and Cemeteries in Pennsylvania Multiple Property Documentation Form. We call it an MPDF. So an MPDF is a context document under which it becomes easier to list things in the National Register by taking the hard work of establishing a context off of the plate of the person proposing a cemetery for registration. This specifically was looking at African American churches and cemeteries between 1644 and 1970. It focuses on explaining how the Black church and African American cemeteries as community institutions are significant in the Commonwealth and how that's shown within the built environment. Black churches and cemeteries survive as testaments to community building by and for African Americans and often share a symbiotic relationship of origin and support. We wanted to be able to list both the church and the cemetery, just the church, or just a cemetery. So we went through and developed a context under which that could be done. We had to create associated property types under this particular type of document. It's a grouping of properties characterized by similar traits. So we created 1 for churches under the traditional Black church and 4 for African American cemeteries. These are kind of the subgroups that they fall into. So it would be a family cemetery, an enslaved persons cemetery, independent cemetery, or segregated cemetery. We have to focus on significance outside of any religious practice and focus on the built environment itself. So again, we established registration requirements in an attempt to make it easier to list these resources in the National Register. And we have had some great success in using this particular document to list churches. These are just some of the, cemeteries. These are just some of the ones we've listed in the last few years. This was done by Dr. Steve Berg and his class in Shippensburg. This is the Locust Grove Cemetery in Shippensburg. It is an historic African American cemetery, the burial location for 47 African American veterans from every major conflict from the Civil War to the Vietnam. It has 26 known Civil War veterans who served in the United States Colored Troops from 1863 to 1865, including 3 men who served in the 54th and 55th Massachusetts Volunteer Regiments, which were featured in the movie Glory. This is Mount Tabor AME Zion Church and Cemetery. This was listed in 2021. This was an African American church and associated cemetery from 1886 in Mount Holly Springs in Cumberland County. The church was established by formerly enslaved and then free individuals who migrated to Mount Holly Springs in search of a better quality of life and work opportunities after the Civil War. The church was the heart of the community here until the congregation dwindled to about 3 families in 1970 and went largely unknown until around 2016 when an oral history project in the area brought attention to it. And this was listed under the traditional Black church with an associated cemetery property type. And that's the cemetery that goes with it. And then we have Midland Cemetery. Midland Cemetery in Swatara Township, Steelton, is significant under National Register Criterion A for ethnic heritage for its association with the African American community in the area of social history, for the Midland Cemetery's role as a site of memory and commemoration in the Steelton-Swatara Township African American community. This was an example of the independent cemetery subtype. One of the things we get asked frequently is how to do research on your historic cemetery. Often you'll need to start with ownership, and that involves some potentially deed research. Start with the most current owner you know and go backwards from there. The county assessor or GIS mapping can be useful in establishing who the current owner of the cemetery is. But as we have found in some of the cemeteries we've worked with, sometimes that involves legal counsel and court cases in order to firmly establish ownership. The state archives often get asked these questions as well. They have cemetery information on veterans cards, death certificates, and on some state hospitals in the Commonwealth. But unfortunately, there is no state collection of burial removals or internments. They often suggest the best place to look for cemetery information are local newspapers and historic newspapers. PA Share can actually be a great resource as well for some cemetery information. This notes that we have 1,400 resources, individual resources with the name cemetery associated with them. So there's a chance that we might already have some information about a cemetery in your community. I also pulled a couple of books off of our shelf just this afternoon that we often have been given or have collected. So we have books on, this is on Gettysburg's Evergreen Cemetery, and we have one with a hand-drawn map of Huntington County in Pennsylvania as well. So we keep resources like this in our library as well. So it's sometimes worth it to reach out to your local state historic preservation office and see if they have any information about a cemetery as well. So we reached the Q&A part. So these are some of the questions that we get asked on a frequent basis and some of the questions that were submitted by all of you. So, does a landowner have a requirement to maintain a cemetery on their property? No, but under Title IX, they are required to provide reasonable access. There is not a specific definition of reasonable access, but they are required to provide it. Do I need to notify anyone that I've found a headstone on my property? Not necessarily if you don't propose to remove it. We do ask that you notify our office so that we can record it as a burial place and so that there can be a record of it. But you are not required to notify anyone that you found it on your own private property. Can anyone build something on top of or adjacent to a cemetery? Only after you move it. The land can be built on once the burials have been removed, or a lot of public projects will do everything in their power to avoid the cemetery, which leads to the next question: how can we be sure we're avoiding a cemetery when designing our project? I asked our archaeologists about this. They suggest extending out at least 100 feet from a known grave site. We have a colloquial expression in our office called the wandering Quaker, where occasionally you will find someone buried just outside the boundary of a cemetery. Just because there is a fence there, you shouldn't always assume that that's where the cemetery always stopped. So a 100-foot buffer would give you an edge to try. What is the process for the removal of headstones and or disinterring and reinterring burials from an historic cemetery? It includes the Court of Common Pleas with written consent from the landowner or a descendant if they can be located. And this was a series of questions that are all kind of related that were passed on to me. So, how can you access private property, cemeteries? How do you close down cemeteries? What are the laws regarding still operating cemeteries? All of those are covered by Title IX, which is the burial grounds and the Pennsylvania Consolidated Statutes. They handle all of the sale and exchanges of burial grounds and the access issue that we just talked about. So they are required to provide access to the cemetery, but it is not specific in timing or, what hours or how much access needs to be provided. There are also provisions in there to limit the liability of specific property owners when people access a cemetery on private property, so that they are not necessarily liable if you trip and fall, or if there's an accident on the cemetery while you're on their grounds. So, a lot of information. I hope that it was interesting and helpful, and I would love to try to answer additional questions that may come up. Overall, I'd ask that you continue to advocate for cleaner, stronger laws regarding cemeteries and burials in the Commonwealth, in order to make it easier for everyone to access, hopefully, and preserve and protect historic cemeteries across the Commonwealth.
Okay. You did a great job answering most of the questions that were submitted, even the ones you hadn't seen yet. So, wonderful. I guess we do have just a few. This first one,
Jeannie, you need to talk up a little louder because it's very hard to hear you.
uh, so can you hear me?
It's
Yes.
very faint.
Oh dear. Let me see if I can adjust this. Is this any better?
That's
Lots.
great.
Great, okay. So, we do have one question. I'm not sure if you'll know the answer to it, but it was submitted by a Sakina Nazir. How many feet were required to dig for a burial in the 1800s? I'm guessing depth-wise was the question.
I don't think any of the burial laws ever went that
Yeah.
specific. So unfortunately, I can't give you a great answer to that. Probably both shallower than you think and deeper than you think at all the same time.
Thank you. We have another question. This one is actually from Renee Nichols, who is one of our board members. Are green burials allowed in PA? Where or why not?
So green burials is a pretty new issue for us, that we haven't really we haven't asked our legal counsel on how exactly to do that. I'm from some of the light Googling that I was doing to, even think about that issue, because I had seen a question on that. I believe that scattering of cremains is legal. I don't know that you need to it won't create a burial ground, let me put it that way, by scattering cremains. But that is an area of the law that has not been addressed yet through Pennsylvania legislation, and I don't know if that's the case in other states.
Okay. Here's a question. Who would we connect to okay a new burial in a historic cemetery?
Ooh, that's a great question. I think it depends on whether or not the historic cemetery is still is like a registered cemetery. So there are different rules if it is a cemetery that is registered with the Commonwealth as a business, versus an historic burial place that they did not anticipate additional burials going into. Mostly it would default to the property owner, I believe. But the Department of Real Estate actually controls a lot of current cemetery registrations, so that might be a place to start.
Great. Okay. Just received a question from Thornberry AME. Our historical cemetery was vandalized. What steps should we take, and is there any funding?
So, sort of. So, if the cemetery is listed or eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places and is owned by a municipality or a nonprofit entity, you could apply for Keystone Funds, which is a state grant that our office administers that can be used for bricks and mortar work on resources. So it could be used on a project such as that. I would encourage you to reach out to conservators to try to establish the best treatment plan for working with historic stones. And our office can help connect you in some cases with folks that do that work, so that you're making sure that you're treating them in an appropriate manner. So there may be some funding for that. Unfortunately, it's a cyclical grant process, so they're not kind of emergency funds available at the moment that an incident might happen. But that's unfortunate. I'm sorry.
Okay. From Stephen Lyons, we have, what if a property owner is planning to develop a property, residential, and it is believed to hold a Native American burial ground? What's the process for determining if there is in fact a burial ground, and is there a specific law pertaining to Native American burial grounds?
So the Native American Grave Repatriation Act, which is NAGPRA, is the national law that is involves Native American burials specifically. I can tell you that if a project involves any sort of state or federal funding, licensing, or permitting, our office would have a review of that work, including by our team of archaeologists. So if there were potential archaeological resources there, it would be flagged by our team for review. If the project is done on private property with private funding, our office does not review any projects like that. So that's when a variety of other state laws might come into place, including Title IX, including the Historic Places Preservation Act. I would encourage you, if you know of a project like that you think is happening in your community, reach out to our office or the State Historic Preservation Office in the state that you live in, and see if it is under review by your SHPO.
Okay. A question from Chaz Wargo. Does Title IX afford a process to retroactively address ancient cemeteries that may have been shut down with remains not transferred, say in Philadelphia in the 18th century?
Interestingly, some of the laws on the books don't apply to Philadelphia. So I'd have to go back and look specifically at Title IX and see how it applies to the city. It has to do with cities of the first class, cities of the second class, and all those kinds of things. So I'm not sure. I have my email address on the screen, so please send me an email and we can talk further about it, please.
Great. Okay. Roth Cemetery Services asks, could you provide information regarding present-day burial regulations, specifically when a traditional burial needs to be backfilled after the funeral, or could you provide a person that would know this information?
I can provide a person that would know that information if given the chance to look it up. So again, send me an email. It's erera@pa.gov, and I can put you in touch with someone who can answer your question more specifically.
Great. Okay.
Jim Baldwin, Renee Nichols.
Yeah, Renee, I think, added a comment to answer that 1800s question. Jim Baldwin, who volunteered at Union Cemetery in Bellefonte for 35 years, said 6 feet has always been the rule. Okay, it looks like we have a question that just came in from William Jeffries. My question for the East Middletown cemeteries have unmarked graves. I have filed 5 complaints against the Cemetery Association due to not allowing me to view any burial records in hope of determining that the graves that are unmarked. The complaints were filed with the PA State Attorney General's Office, Department of State Division of Investigations, Commonwealth of PA Office of General Counsel, Londonderry Township Representative David Hickernell, Widener University Pro Bono Law School, Pennsylvania ACLU. All complaints, I was told we can do nothing because the Cemetery Association would not talk to anyone about anything, that I had no right to ask to view any records. So I'm not sure if you want to clarify, Mr. Jeffries, what question you would like for our speaker to address. If you want to maybe raise your hand and unmute. Or if you want to add more information, we can ask others who might have questions that came to them to raise their hands, and then they can unmute and ask us a question to our speaker if there are any others.
We do hear quite often from folks who have not had success in finding property owners or, resources that are not being maintained well. And unfortunately, our office doesn't have, we're not a permitting agency. We're not regulatory in that way. So we don't kind of have the teeth to be able to assist with regulations like that. That said, we are really good at bringing people together. So I'm happy to talk to you further about, trying to put you in touch with some folks that might be able to help.
Tell her you're here. I'm here.
Hi.
How you doing?
Good.
Yeah, my basic question is, I found a lot of complaints with this association. They seem not to care about unmarked graves and the people that are buried there. And I had like 7 relatives that I basically started out with, but their attitude is they don't care. We ain't talking about nothing. We ain't showing you nothing. And he is, as I stated, I even eventually went to pro bono from Widener University here in Pennsylvania, close to where I live. And they wouldn't even, I was hoping that they would send them a letter so tell them we go to court or something, and they wouldn't even do nothing because they won't talk to nobody. They're basically saying, we're not letting you see anything. They might have been burying people over top of people because they say they had no records. The guy that was in charge, he's basically a liar. He's a hypocrite. He cares about his relative, though. He puts himself in the paper talking about trying to get a gravestone for his World War II uncle. And that's more important, and people should care. But when it comes to me asking for my relatives and others that are now being discovered, they have no markers or you don't know where they are, they don't care. That whole association don't care. So when I put them on the news, the ABC 27, they basically hating me. So now their thing is we don't want to talk about nothing. The pro bono lawyer had thought she had a chance to talk to him and view some records, and they called her and told the pro bono lawyer, well, we're not coming to your office with anything because we had a meeting and we ain't bringing nothing or want you to see anything. So they even told the pro bono lawyers at Widener University, we ain't showing you nothing. Mm-hmm. And basically the girl that did the TV thing, the news thing on 27 News, she even says in her report of the issue, she tried to talk to them and they said, we ain't talking. And that was in the beginning. So like I've been trying to get information since before 2017. Mm-hmm. And all the complaints I filed went through state agencies also, but nobody seems to care. And I found out that David Hicker now, because that's where the cemeteries are, they're down in Londonderry Township, not actually in Middletown, but they're in Londonderry Township. Well, here he helped sponsor a law on behalf of private property cemeteries. He helped sponsor a law because relatives was denied access. So here's a representative that helped sponsor a law to gain access, which is a law now. Mm-hmm. Okay, but I can't get no help. So looks like a lot of bias or whatever you want to call it, who they want to help and all that kind of stuff. So, and all I wanted to do was like, if anything, if I had an idea, not trying to step on somebody else's grave, and I state that in my complaint with the Attorney General's office, who was our now governor, Josh, what's his name?
Shapiro.
Josh Shapiro. He was the Attorney General. And at the time, he was on TV always promoting about, I'm going to make sure that these nonprofits, 501(c)(3)s, are held accountable. Well, obviously, he didn't care nothing about my complaint, obviously. But since he was on TV talking all that about nonprofits and holding them accountable, which he did, because it was on TV at the time, and he was holding nonprofits accountable. But I guess I wasn't important enough, or my family members or other people's family members were not important enough.
Mr. Jeffries,
yes.
yeah, let's hold on a second. Elizabeth, is there any place that you can direct him to that would be helpful for him with his request to get access to the information that he is requesting, the family plot maybe, or maybe they have a map hidden somewhere, in the back of the closet.
Yeah.
I have one, so.
I mean, I can check our records to see if we have any information about a documented cemetery in that area. I would encourage you to try maybe the state archives to see if they may have information related to the corporation, perhaps there, or historic maps of that area. If you send me an email with the location and then an address for the cemetery, I can do a search through our database at least and see if we can maybe start there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, there's
All right.
there's two cemeteries. I can send you them.
Okay.
Address.
Well, Mr. Jeffries, what I'm going to ask you to do, because we're going to be running out of time here, is
Yes.
to send a document, or, just like you typed it into the chat, type it into an email. If you want to, you can send it to me and I can send it on to Elizabeth, or she can give you a direct contact and maybe put whatever she wants into the chat so everybody can get it. All right.
It's on the
And we'll
screen
just,
there too. Yep.
I'm sorry. And just go through that so that we can just, try to pull your question together and what your needs are and see what we can do to get them answered for you. Okay.
Yes, I'm just trying to put some markers down, memorials.
I know. And I appreciate what you're trying to do. But I think it'll be even better if you can just document it and send it off to Elizabeth, and then she can try to maybe trace it out, and hopefully we can get some better answers for you than what we can get right now. Okay.
Sounds good.
All right. Thank you so much for your questions and also for attending. Esther, Jeannie, I'm going back to you. Do you have any other people that want to ask a question that we have time for?
We do have two questions that might be fairly quick to answer. Let's see. We have Teresa Riley saying, when it says there should be reasonable access, what happens when the roads inside the cemetery are not passable, not even by a hearse?
Oh, I'm not sure that the law requires that they maintain any sort of route within the cemetery, just that they provide access to get into the cemetery. But I would have to read the title again to make sure that's the case. But if you Google Title IX Burial Law, Pennsylvania, the word version of it will come up, so you can find the letter of the law there.
And I, just so everyone knows, I put a link to the Title IX text in the chat.
Oh, great.
So I'll send that again at the end in case you missed it. So we have one last question here. It looks like John Wagner says, are there any grants or funding to help with cemeteries that have fallen to the wayside? And can a cemetery invest money to help provide for the future of its care?
So I mentioned the Keystone grants as a potential funding source for cemeteries. But there are other, sometimes some private grants that may be available. We get the funding question all the time, and unfortunately, there is just not a lot of preservation money out there. I wish there was. If you happen to be in a certified local government, which is a National Park Service designation, which our office administers, there's money for planning, preservation plans for cemeteries that might be owned by the municipality that we could talk to you about. But for general maintenance, unfortunately, we don't have that kind of funds.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. I think that's all of the questions we have. So,
I have one question that is on my mind, and that is, and I'm going to let you go with this. Now, we talked about having a road through the cemetery, of course, because it's on the property of the cemetery. I don't, as you mentioned, they don't really have to have a maintained road within the cemetery. But what if the road is over the cemetery, and a lot of it sticks out on either side of that road? Can they make them reroute that road?
I mean, there is a law that prohibits the construction of a road through a cemetery in places other than Philadelphia.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Would that be under the Title IX?
that was one of the other laws. Let's see. I'd have to look back and see which one it was.
Mm-hmm.
I can send you the language of it. Let me see if I can find it.
Yeah, well, you can do that, and then we can post it for everybody.
Sure.
And we are running on 2 minutes, but we do have one question left.
Sure.
Jeannie?
Go ahead.
Jeannie?
this one's from Sheila Jones, another of our board members. How is local, state, and national significance determined for the National Register for cemeteries?
Sure. It's determined on an individual basis. So each individual property that we consider for eligibility in the National Register is weighed against 4 criteria: A, B, C, and D. So it's significance associated with specific events in history, people in history, for architecture and its design, or for its association with archaeology. So we weigh every property against one of those 4 criteria. The significance level is personalized to each property. I would say the vast majority of properties that are listed in the National Register, probably across the country, but specifically in the Commonwealth, are significant at the local level. So you can list things that are significant to your community on the National Register of Historic Places. Recently, we've listed things we're working on listing things at both different levels. There was the Craig family cemetery, which was an enslaved person cemetery in Susquehanna Township. We listed at the local level of significance, all the way over to Grandview Cemetery, which is in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, associated with the flood. That is proposed for listing at the national level of significance. So there's a real range, and we evaluate each one differently.
Well, Elizabeth, we thank you so much for these answering
me.
our questions and these topics.
Excuse me, Crystal.
Again, I'm Bertha. Go ahead.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Sure.
I did put in one last question in the chat. And that is, are you aware if other states' cemetery laws are any clearer than Pennsylvania laws?
So I was looking that up a little bit today. It varies state to state.
Mm-hmm.
Some cases you can find a really clear explanation. Maryland has a great web page that lists all of their burial things. New Jersey has some good ones. Massachusetts had some good, clear legislation, but it really varies state to state.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Everyone, thank you very much. Check out our website, YouTube, for Elizabeth's presentation. And Elizabeth, we thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Have a great night, everyone. And look, I'm so sorry. Also, look for our next roundtable, which will be in June. Stay tuned.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful holiday that's coming up. And take care. Elizabeth, thanks a lot.
Absolutely. Anytime. Thank you.
All
See you
righty.
soon.
For my board members, I'm going to talk to you in a minute.